Somewhere in the highlands of Myanmar, in a monastery that sits above the cloud line, a single candle burns. It has been burning for 3 days. The flame does not move, not because there is no wind, but because the man sitting beside it breathes so slowly, so completely without urgency, that even the air around him seems to have entered a kind of agreement with his stillness. His name is not important. What he is doing is, he has not spoken since Tuesday. He has not eaten. He has not shifted his position, adjusted his robe, or responded to the 2 researchers who arrived yesterday from a university in Bangkok with portable monitoring equipment and a set of questions they no longer feel comfortable asking. They stand just outside the door. They have been standing there for 6 hours. One of them checks the pulse oximeter readout for the 4th time and says nothing. The monk's heart rate is 7 beats per minute. For context, a sleeping adult averages between 50 and 70. A trained athlete at rest might reach 40. 7 is a number that does not belong to ordinary human biology, and yet there he sits, breathing, alive, somewhere. That last word is the one that matters, because the question the 2 researchers cannot bring themselves to voice, the question that has no clinical answer and no precedent in any literature they were trained to trust, is simply this: where is he? His body is in that room, his lungs are moving, just barely, his heart is beating, slower than most people's clocks tick. But the thing that animates a person, the quality of presence that makes a face look lived in rather than abandoned, that thing is elsewhere. Something about the stillness of his features suggests not absence, but departure. Not unconsciousness, but distance, as if he left through a door that no one else in that room can see, and he will return when he is ready, and not a moment before. Most people, if they have thought about meditation at all, have thought about it as something modest, a breathing exercise, a way to manage stress, something you do for 10 minutes on a phone app between meetings. The modern world has given meditation a very specific shape: quiet, contained, therapeutic. It is good for your blood pressure. It helps with anxiety. It makes you slightly more patient in traffic. This is what most people have been told. This is what most people believe. What that man is doing in that room has no relationship to any of that. What he is practicing is something that was refined and studied and transmitted across an unbroken chain of human lifetimes, stretching back 2,500 years. It was considered so powerful and so genuinely dangerous that for most of Buddhist history, it was taught only in private, only to students who had spent years preparing to receive it, and only by teachers who had already traveled the territory themselves and returned with maps. The maps still exist. Fragments of them are written in Pali and Sanskrit, pressed into palm leaves that crumble when touched. Fragments live in the memories of elderly monks in mountain monasteries in Laos and Tibet, transmitted not in writing but in whispers, in the particular quality of a teacher's silence, in the moment after a question, when the answer comes not in words, but in something that happens to the air between 2 people. This documentary is those fragments, assembled. This is the map. And the man in the room, still sitting, still silent, still 7 heartbeats per minute, is the destination. There is a version of meditation that you can purchase for $9.99 per month. It comes with a soothing voice, a progress tracker, and a congratulatory notification when you complete a streak. The voice tells you to notice your breath, to let your thoughts pass like clouds, to be present. It is not insincere. The people who built it believe in what they are offering, and for the problems it addresses, the low-grade anxiety of modern life, the scattered attention of a mind raised on notifications, the shallow breathing that comes from sitting at a desk for 8 hours, it is genuinely useful. But here is what that app cannot tell you, because the people who built it do not know. What it is offering is approximately the first 3 minutes of a journey that, in its original form, takes decades and ends somewhere that has no name in any modern language. Imagine you found a partial recipe for a dish that, according to the people who once made it, could completely alter the chemistry of the human body. The partial recipe you found says, combine flour, water, and heat. You follow it. You produce something edible. You call it bread. And you believe, reasonably, that you now understand what the recipe was for. What you don't know, because the rest of the recipe was never written down in any place you have access to, is that the original dish required 47 ingredients, prepared over 4 days, in a sequence that unlocked specific compounds that the flour and water alone could never produce. That is the gap between what most people know as meditation and what the monks in the ancient forest traditions were actually doing. The word itself is partly responsible for the confusion. Meditation, in English, simply means to think deeply about something. It is a cognitive word. It implies effort, reflection, deliberate mental activity. The Pali word most often translated as meditation is bhavana, which means, more precisely, development, cultivation. The systematic training of the mind in the way that a farmer cultivates land, patiently, over seasons, with specific techniques applied in a specific sequence, toward a specific harvest. The harvest, in this case, was not relaxation. It was not stress reduction. It was not even wisdom in the philosophical sense. The harvest was access. Access to states of consciousness so far outside ordinary human experience that the monks who entered them reported that the world as normally perceived, the solid, bounded, time-ordered world of objects and identities and cause and effect, was revealed, from within those states, to be only one layer of a structure far more complex, far more strange, and far more navigable than anyone who had not entered those states could possibly imagine. When a technology executive in California talks about meditating for 20 minutes before his stand-up meeting, he is using the same word to describe something that resembles the original practice, the way a candle resembles the sun. Both produce light. The comparison ends there. This is not a criticism of the technology executive. It is not a criticism of anyone who has found genuine value in the accessible, secular version of mindfulness that now permeates the wellness world. The simplified version of these practices still offers something real, but there is a cost to the simplification that no one has honestly calculated. And the cost is this. When you reduce a multidimensional technology to its most accessible feature, you make people believe that the accessible feature is the whole thing. You close doors that should remain open. You answer questions that should remain alive. The people who designed these ancient systems knew something that the modern wellness industry has quietly forgotten. They knew that the mind, trained with sufficient precision and sufficient patience, is not just capable of becoming calmer. It is capable of becoming something else entirely, something that perceives realities that the untrained mind cannot reach and cannot even conceive of, something that can go places. The monk in that room is going somewhere right now. The question is where? And answering that question requires going back a very long way. Long before any European mariner drew a coastline on parchment, long before anyone mapped a river delta or charted the depth of an ocean floor, a group of men in the forests of ancient Asia were making maps of a different kind. Their territory had no shoreline. It could not be measured in miles or degrees of latitude. It had no mountains that could be climbed with the body, no valleys that could be crossed on foot, and yet their maps were extraordinarily precise. They used coordinates that were psychological rather than geographical, marking territories by the quality of awareness that defined them, the specific characteristics that a trained mind would recognize as landmarks, the signs that indicated both progress and danger. These men were the first systematic explorers of human consciousness, and the documents they left behind, the Abhidhamma texts, the Pali Suttas, the Tibetan Tantric manuals, are at their core field reports. Not beliefs, not theology. Field reports from practitioners who went somewhere difficult and came back with detailed accounts of what they found. The Abhidhamma alone, compiled from the teachings of the earliest Buddhist communities, catalogues 89 distinct types of consciousness, organized by function, quality, and the conditions that give rise to each. This is not poetry, it is classification. The same rigorous taxonomic impulse that led early naturalists to catalogue species and early astronomers to name constellations drove these monks to map the interior of the human mind with a precision that still has no equivalent in modern psychology. Two figures stand just at the edge of this story's beginning, unnamed here because their names will come later, when their full significance can be understood. What can be said of them now is this: they were practitioners of deep states so extreme that their communities appointed monitors to watch over them during practice, not to protect the room, but to protect the practitioner, because what they were doing carried real risks. The territory they were entering was not metaphorical, and the return journey, the texts quietly note, was not guaranteed, not because anything external threatened them, but because the states they were entering were so completely unlike ordinary consciousness, so utterly without the usual anchors of time and location and self, that some practitioners, a small number, carefully documented, entered those states and never fully returned. Their bodies came back. but something in them had gone so far that ordinary life never quite fit again. This documentary is their map, not a biography, not a theology, not a wellness guide, a map of territory that is real, that has been visited, that has been documented, and that is still accessible to any human mind willing to take the journey with the seriousness it requires. You are about to follow it. The first landmark is 2,500 years ago, in a forest in ancient India, before a single temple had been built. Before there were monks, there was forest. Before there were robes or rules or monasteries with bells that rang at specific hours to organize the day into devotion and labor and rest. Before any of that structure existed, there were individuals. Solitary, strange, and extraordinarily determined individuals who walked away from the social world and sat down in the wilderness and refused to leave until they had found an answer to a question that most people, then as now, do not think of as answerable. The question was not theological. It was not about God or the afterlife or the structure of the cosmos in any religious sense. It was simpler and far more radical than any of that. The question was this: what, exactly, is the mind? Not what it does, not what it thinks or feels or remembers, but what it fundamentally is, in the absence of all its contents. What remains when everything the mind has ever thought, felt, feared, or wanted is stripped away? What is the thing that's left? In the forests of ancient India, approximately 5 centuries before the Common Era, a class of wandering seekers called Shramanas was attempting to answer this question through direct investigation, not through scripture or ritual or reasoning, through practice, through the systematic, patient, sometimes violent discipline of the attention, pushed beyond ordinary limits until the mind's own deepest nature revealed itself. These were not gentle people. Jain practitioners among them reportedly stood motionless for hours in the sun, pulling out their own hair rather than cutting it, enduring cold and heat and hunger as training for a kind of mental toughness that ordinary life could not produce. Vedic trance traditions produced practitioners who could enter states of unmoving stillness for days. Shamanistic lineages, older still, had developed techniques for deliberately inducing altered states of consciousness through breath, rhythm, darkness, and isolation. Techniques whose purpose was not entertainment but navigation, the deliberate, skilled movement of awareness into territories that the ordinary waking mind cannot reach. This is the soil from which Buddhist meditation grew, not from a single inspired teacher, but from centuries of accumulated experimentation by men and women who treated the mind the way an engineer treats a complex system, by testing it at its limits, noting what happened, adjusting the approach, and testing again. The man who would later be called the Buddha was not the first person to attempt this project. Before he reached the Bodhi tree, before the night that changed the history of human thought, he spent years training under 2 teachers. Their names are preserved in the texts, Ajara Kalama and Uddaka Ramaputta. These were not minor figures. Both were accomplished meditators with large followings, recognized across the region for attainments that placed them at the outer edge of what was then understood to be possible. Ajara Kalama had reportedly mastered the 7th Jhana, the state of nothingness, where conscious awareness continues in a complete absence of any perceptible content. Uddaka Ramaputta's attainment was described as the 8th, neither perception nor non-perception, a state so refined it defies any description that ordinary language can produce. The young seeker trained under both of them. He mastered their techniques. He reached what they had reached, and then he stopped. Not because he was satisfied, but because he wasn't. Because he recognized, in those extraordinary states, something they had apparently not noticed, a subtlety of residual craving, a barely perceptible grasping at the very experience of liberation, that meant even these extraordinary states were not the final answer. The map, he realized, was incomplete. There was further to go. No one had gone there. No guide existed. He went anyway. And what happened when he did is one of the strangest and most consequential events in the history of human consciousness. Most people who know anything about the Buddha know the outline of the story. A prince who gave up his palace, a night under a tree, and enlightenment at dawn. It is one of the most recognizable stories in world history, repeated across 2.5 millennia, in 10,000 languages, and as many artistic forms. A serene figure, seated in perfect stillness, bathed in golden light. What the popular version leaves out is the technical sequence, What actually happened during those hours, according to the earliest texts, was not a passive reception of insight. It was an active traversal of a territory more extreme than anything a human mind had yet entered. It was, by any honest description, a journey, systematic, disciplined, and at its furthest point, genuinely dangerous. The texts describe the sequence in careful detail. As the night began, he entered the first jhana, the state of focused absorption in which the habitual noise of the thinking mind drops away completely. He had done this many times before, but this time, instead of remaining there or moving to a familiar landmark, he moved on. Second jhana, the dissolution of even the subtle effort of concentration, replaced by a current of aliveness that the body contains but did not produce. He moved on. Third jhana, the fading of that aliveness into something the texts call equanimity, a stillness so deep that happiness itself begins to seem like agitation by comparison. He moved on. Fourth jhana, the breath almost stops. The body is present but does not demand attention. The mind is alert but no longer oriented toward any object. Time, in the ordinary sense, ceases to function as a framework. He moved on. Fifth, sixth, seventh, into the immaterial realms where space becomes infinite and then consciousness becomes infinite, and then both collapse into what the texts call nothingness, not darkness, but the recognition of awareness itself in the total absence of anything to be aware of. He moved on, and then he reached the eighth state. Neither perception nor non-perception, the furthest recorded point of human consciousness, the edge of the map that all his teachers had helped him reach but none had crossed. He moved on. What happened next is described in the texts with a precision that is almost clinical in its understatement. He passed through something the tradition calls Nirodha Samapatti, the cessation of perception and feeling. At this depth, even the most subtle mental formations stop. The monitoring functions that tell a mind where it is, that it exists, that it has a direction and a history, all of these go quiet. The practitioner at this level is not unconscious. Unconsciousness is an absence of awareness. What this state represents is awareness in the complete absence of any content whatsoever. Awareness without an object, without a subject, without even the observation that awareness is occurring. The texts note, with unusual care, that a practitioner must set an intention before entering this state, a kind of timed emergence, because from within the state, there is no vantage point from which to decide to leave. The decision must be made before the door closes. He set the intention, he entered, he emerged. At dawn, the texts say, with a knowledge of consciousness so comprehensive, so experientially complete, that he spent the next 45 years trying to transmit it to others. Here is what the popular version of this story does not say. Not everyone who attempted to follow him all the way returned the same way he did. The state he had entered and navigated was so extreme that later practitioners who approached it without adequate preparation sometimes found that the door, once passed through, did not open easily from the inside. Not because the state itself was harmful, but because the depth of the shift in perception was so total that re-engaging with ordinary reality required a capacity that not everyone possessed. Enlightenment, in its original framing, was not a spiritual reward. It was the successful completion of the most extreme inner journey a human being can attempt. And like all extreme journeys, it had a survival dimension that no one who stayed home could understand. Something happens to dangerous knowledge when it is carried by an institution. The institution softens it, not out of dishonesty, but out of genuine concern, and out of the practical reality that managing large numbers of people requires a simpler, safer version of the truth than the one that operates at the frontier. This is not a cynical observation. It is a pattern that appears in every field of human knowledge, from medicine to physics to music. The public-facing version of a practice is almost never the version that lives at its outermost edge. In the centuries following the Buddha's death, as his teachings spread across Asia and were codified into monasteries and councils and formal scriptural traditions, the deepest practices underwent precisely this process. They were not suppressed in the sense of being destroyed or denied. They were quietly set aside, reserved, made conditional on levels of preparation that fewer and fewer practitioners ever achieved, and in many cases, the most extreme techniques were removed from written transmission entirely and preserved only in direct, private communication between a teacher and a single trusted student. The reasons were real. The practices that led into the deeper jhanas and the formless realms were not suitable for general distribution, in the same way that surgical procedures are not suitable for home experimentation. Without a teacher who had navigated the territory, without the protective framework of a practice community, without the specific safeguards that the traditions had developed through painful experience, the deepest practices could produce outcomes that were destabilizing rather than liberating. The texts themselves contain warnings. Certain states, approached without preparation, could trigger experiences that resembled psychosis from the outside and felt, from the inside, like a disintegration of the self that offered no clear path to reconstruction. So the teachers drew a quiet boundary. The public teaching, the foundation of ethics, the practice of mindfulness, the cultivation of compassion, these remained open, widely taught, and genuinely valuable. They still are. But the next room, and the room after that, and the rooms that no longer had walls in the ordinary sense, those were accessible only through a different kind of door, a door that required a key, and the key was a living teacher who had been there. The result, across the centuries, was a geography of knowledge, a public territory that was large and rich and genuinely transformative, and within it, a series of inner chambers whose doors were not locked but were not advertised. The deeper the chamber, the smaller the number of people who knew it existed, and smaller still, the number who had the preparation to enter. 3 lineages preserved the deepest fragments. In Tibet, the Dzogchen tradition maintained a transmission of practices so extreme, including dark retreat, consciousness transference, and the deliberate navigation of the death experience, that its texts were hidden as terma, buried in mountains and lakes, to be rediscovered by specific practitioners in future generations when the world was ready. In Southeast Asia, the forest monk traditions of Thailand, Myanmar, and Sri Lanka quietly maintained a living transmission of jhana practice that institutionalized Buddhism had largely abandoned. In China, the Chan tradition, which would later become Zen in Japan, preserved a transmission of sudden insight that bypassed doctrinal study entirely, passed from mind to mind through the specific relationship of teacher and student, sometimes through a single exchange that changed everything. Each of these lineages held a different piece of the original map. Each piece was genuine. None of them, individually, contained the whole picture, and for centuries, the pieces did not speak to each other. This documentary is the beginning of their conversation, and the first thing they agree on is the architecture, the structure of the practice itself, the system that underlies all of them. That system has 8 levels, and the first one alone is stranger than almost anything the modern world considers possible. Imagine a building with 8 floors, where each floor is built from a different material, oriented in a different direction, and illuminated by a light that has no source. On the ground floor, things look roughly familiar, quieter than outside, calmer, but still recognizably the same building you walked into. By the time you reach the 8th floor, you are no longer sure the building exists. You are no longer sure you exist. And the strangest part is not the disorientation. The strangest part is how clear everything becomes. This is the Jhāna system, the progressive states of meditative absorption, documented in the Pali texts and preserved, in various forms, across every major branch of the Buddhist world. 8 stages, each one less connected to ordinary reality than the last. Each one more precisely mapped, more carefully described, more thoroughly verified by independent practitioners across cultures and centuries than almost any other set of interior experiences in human history. The first jhana. You have been practicing long enough that something shifts. The ordinary mental noise, the planning, the remembering, the rehearsing of conversations, the awareness of discomfort in the knees, all of it does not disappear so much as lose its authority. The mind settles into its object with a completeness that most people have never experienced. Not through force. Force doesn't work at this depth. Through something more like gravity, a natural settling, the mind finding its actual resting point rather than its habitual one. The texts describe 2 qualities that characterize this state, vitakka and vichara, which translate approximately as initial and sustained thought, but which function here less like ordinary thinking and more like a gentle, effortless touching of the object of attention again and again, the way a tongue finds a sore spot without being directed to. The effort of attention is present, the strain is gone. The second jhana, the effortful touching dissolves. What remains is a stillness that is self-sustaining, And within that stillness, something rises that has no adequate translation into English. The Pali word is piti. It is usually rendered as rapture or joy, but neither word captures it. Piti is a quality of aliveness, a full-body electrical presence that originates nowhere and travels everywhere, as if the cells of the body have been told a secret they have been waiting their whole lives to hear. Some practitioners describe it as the opposite of pain. Not pleasure exactly, but the absence of the friction that ordinary existence generates without anyone noticing. You notice it only when it stops. And in the second jhana, it stops being generated by anything outside you and starts being the ground you stand on. Third jhana. The piti itself becomes noise. It fades, not unpleasantly, but the way a large sound fades when you step into a smaller, quieter room. What replaces it is something the texts call sukha, a quality of ease so complete that the pleasure of the second state seems, in retrospect, almost turbulent. The mind is still. The body is still. Nothing is wanted. Nothing is lacked. The equanimity here is not the grey equanimity of not caring. It is the luminous equanimity of having nothing to push against. Fourth jhana. This is the state from which the researchers in Myanmar recorded a heartbeat of 7. The breath has slowed to the edge of detectability. The body is present, but has withdrawn its demands completely. The mind is awake with a quality of alertness, so pure that later accounts often describe it as the mind watching itself, not reflexively, not with strain, but with the natural clarity of deep water when the surface has gone absolutely still. This is also the state the texts describe as the launching point, the jhana from which the higher practices become accessible, and from which the classical traditions say certain extraordinary capacities begin to emerge as natural byproducts of the depth of stillness achieved. Most people who meditate their entire lives never reach the first jhana as it is classically defined, not because they lack intelligence or sincerity, but because no one told them it was there. It is there. And the 4 states described above are only the beginning. There is a point in the practice where the body stops being relevant, not where it becomes comfortable or stops causing distraction, but where it stops existing as a reference point at all. The sensation of having a location, of occupying a specific point in space, of being this body in this room at this time, all of that simply ceases to function as the organizing principle of experience. What comes after is not nothingness. It is something far stranger than nothing. The 5th jhana is called the realm of infinite space. To enter it, a practitioner trained in the classical tradition gradually releases the object of meditation, the breath, the body, the concentrated stillness of the 4th jhana, and allows the boundary of awareness to expand, not as a visualization, not as an imagination exercise, as a direct perceptual shift. The experience that has been concentrated, focused, tight, releases. And what it releases into is not emptiness in the way you might imagine emptiness. It is space that has no edge. Not large space, not the space of a room or a continent or a solar system, all of which still have conceptual limits that the mind can reach if it extends itself far enough. This is the space that is left when the concept of limit is removed entirely. Practitioners who have entered this state and returned with articulate reports often fall silent at this point in the description. Language, they say, is a tool designed for bounded things. It cannot measure this. The 6th jhana transforms the infinity of space into the infinity of consciousness itself. The recognizable qualities of awareness, the sense of being a particular consciousness, located, particular, this mind and not another, begin to thin. What replaces them is a quality of knowing that has no specific knower, consciousness aware of consciousness, without the usual story of who is being aware. Some practitioners describe this as the most frightening of the early immaterial states, not because it is unpleasant, but because the feature of experience that they would normally use to assess whether they are okay, the sense of being a specific self who can evaluate what is happening, is precisely the feature that has dissolved. The 7th jhana is the state of nothingness. This requires careful description because the word is almost perfectly misleading. The practitioner in this state is not unconscious. They are not absent. The awareness is clear, vivid, and alert. But its content, the object of awareness, is nothing. Not darkness, which is still an object. Not silence, which is still a sensory condition. Not even the experience of space or consciousness from the previous states. The mind is awake in the full and technical sense of the word, and it is awake in a field that contains no perceivable object whatsoever. This is not a malfunction, this is the state. The texts describe it with a consistency that spans 15 centuries and a dozen independent traditions, all using different words and arriving at the same description: the mind, fully alert, facing nothing. The eighth state has no adequate name. The texts call it neither perception nor non-perception, which is their honest admission that language has reached its frontier. Monks who have entered this state and returned describe the experience as the mind touching its own outer wall. One monastery in northern Thailand keeps records of practitioners who entered this state and required monitoring for over 24 hours before returning. Their fellow monks, watching from outside, could not determine from external observation whether they were alive, or in some state the monastery's centuries of tradition had no word for either. In every case they returned. Not all of them returned the same, but they returned. Which means the eighth state is not the end of the map. It is, the texts insist, only the beginning of the journey the map was made for. Here is a thought that changes everything. What if the jhanas were never the destination? What if every state described in the last two sections, the rapture, the dissolving body, the infinite space, the mind awake in the face of nothing, was not the point of the practice, but the preparation for it? What if all of that was simply a vehicle, the way a rocket must reach a certain altitude before its engines cut off, and it can travel freely through territory that surface conditions cannot access? This is exactly what the classical Buddhist texts say. The jhanas are not the map. They are the mechanism for reading the map. They are the condition under which the territory the map describes becomes accessible. The territory is what Buddhist cosmology calls the realms. This word carries a great deal of baggage, and most of that baggage obscures rather than illuminates what is actually being described. When most Westerners encounter the Buddhist cosmological map, the 31 planes of existence, the Deva realms and Brahma realms and formless realms, arranged in a vertical structure from the lowest hell to the highest plane of existence, they tend to file it under mythology and move on. This is understandable. The map looks, at first glance, like a religious cosmology similar to any other, a structured afterlife, a hierarchy of beings, a universe organized by moral logic. Look again. Look at the technical correspondence between the jhana states and the cosmological realms. The first four jhanas correspond precisely, not approximately, but precisely, to the first four levels of the fine material Brahma world. The four immaterial jhanas correspond to the four formless realms. The mapping is exact, one-to-one, systematic. This is not decoration. This is not a poetic way of describing meditative states. This is a claim, made with the specificity of an engineering diagram, that the internal states accessible through meditation are not merely subjective experiences, they are access points, coordinates in a structure that has objective features independent of the practitioner's personal experience. For the ancient teachers, this was not a metaphysical speculation. It was a practical fact, repeatedly verified through practice. The jhanas were not just pleasant states to be achieved and appreciated. They were the condition under which you could perceive, enter, and interact with planes of existence that are inaccessible to ordinary consciousness, in the same way that radio frequencies are inaccessible to unaided human hearing. Not because they aren't there, but because the receiving equipment first needs to be tuned. The tuning is what the practice produces, and the experiences that become available at each level of tuning are documented in the texts, with a specificity that cannot be adequately explained as coincidence or shared mythology. The Deva realms are described with consistent phenomenological characteristics across Theravada Pali literature, Tibetan tantric texts, and the accounts of contemporary practitioners who have never read either. The same quality of sourceless light, the same effortless well-being, the same encounter with presences whose nature is debated, but whose characteristics are described with remarkable consistency. And then there are the idhis, the capacities that reportedly develop as side effects of deep jhana practice in practitioners who reach a certain level of depth and stability. The ability to perceive events occurring at a distance, the spontaneous arising of detailed memories from previous lifetimes, the ability to project awareness outside the physical body and move it with intentional precision. These are the things that modern culture calls impossible, or paranormal, or superstitious. These are also the things that at least 4 independent ancient traditions, documented with the same careful precision they applied to the jhana states themselves. What you call astral projection, the fragmented, poorly understood, often dismissed experience that people describe in online forums and dismiss as dreams, may be, the evidence suggests, a degraded echo of a sophisticated, systematic, and extraordinarily well-mapped practice that was actively transmitted for centuries before the map was lost. The map, as it turns out, was never destroyed. It was scattered. And the next chapter is where the pieces begin to come back together. There is a question that the ancient texts never fully resolve, and which the documentary chooses not to resolve either, because the resolution, in either direction, would require a certainty that the evidence does not support. The question is this: when a practitioner enters a deep meditative state and encounters what the tradition calls the deva realms, when they experience what is consistently described as a quality of light, a presence, a vividness of awareness that makes ordinary experience feel like a rough draft, are they visiting an actual independent plane of existence? Or are they accessing a particular state of their own consciousness that has specific, consistent, extraordinary qualities? Hold both possibilities. Keep them both. Because what is remarkable is not which answer is correct. What is remarkable is that both the answer that says, "this is a real place," and the answer that says, "this is a profound inner state," produce the same description. The same light, the same quality of effortless, sourceless well-being, the same feeling, and this is the word practitioners consistently reach for across traditions and centuries, of coming home. The Deva realms, in Buddhist cosmology, are the first tier of existence above the human. Not radically different in structure, consciousness still functions in recognizable ways. Time still moves. There is still something that corresponds to experience, but refined in every quality. The suffering that characterizes ordinary human existence is absent, not suppressed, absent. The light is described consistently as emanating from within things rather than falling upon them. The mental life of beings in these realms is described as vast and uncluttered. The way a room feels after decades of accumulated furniture are removed, and what remains is the original space the room always had. Practitioners who have reportedly accessed these states during meditation, not as afterlife destinations, but as living, in-body experience through deep jhana, describe the transition as a softening, as if the edges of perception, which are always slightly rough in ordinary awareness, suddenly become smooth. The Thai forest monk tradition contains detailed accounts of practitioners who encountered deva beings during meditation. The accounts are not sensationalist. They are careful, almost clinical in their specificity. The quality of awareness the encounter produced, the content of what was communicated, the physical and psychological state of the practitioner before and after. These accounts were written down by students who observed the practitioners carefully under conditions designed to minimize the possibility of self-deception. What is striking is not any single account. What is striking is the consistency. 12 centuries of independent reports, from Sri Lanka and Tibet and Thailand and Japan, describing encounters with the same quality of presence, in the same quality of space, accessed through the same quality of meditative depth. Independent witnesses who had no communication with each other, working in different languages, within different doctrinal frameworks, producing descriptions that could have come from a single source. Whether the Deva realms are literal destinations or extraordinary states of mind, and it is possible that this distinction means less than it appears to, they are one of the most consistently documented phenomena in the history of human inner exploration. Something is there, something that is accessible, something that 2,500 years of practice has navigated with enough consistency to qualify as a repeatable finding. The territory above this one is not empty, and the territory that lies further, the Brahma realms, the planes of existence so refined that time itself stops functioning in its ordinary way, is stranger still. Every language has limits. The limits are not accidental. They are drawn by experience, by what the speakers of that language have encountered, needed to describe, had to communicate about. English is an exceptionally practical language, well suited to describing the physical world, social relationships, and abstract systems. It is a poor instrument for what comes next. The Brahma realms are higher than the Deva realms in the classical Buddhist map, corresponding to the deeper Jhana states. The place is accessed through the third and fourth absorptions, and then the four immaterial states above those. In these territories, if territory is even the right word, the qualities of existence shift in ways that require not just new vocabulary, but a different relationship to language itself. Practitioners who have briefly accessed these states and returned with reports consistently describe the failure of ordinary description as part of the experience itself, not as a limitation of the practitioner, but as evidence of how genuinely different the territory is. In the lower Brahma realms, accessible through the deep material jhanas, what the texts call thought begins to function less like an inner event and more like an outer one. Mental intention produces effects with a directness and immediacy that has no equivalent in ordinary experience. Practitioners describe this as something like the difference between imagining building a house and having the house appear. The distance between the impulse and its manifestation, the gap that ordinary life is full of, the gap that frustration and effort and delay occupy, narrows to nothing. What is intended is. Time in these states is unreliable in both directions. Multiple independent practitioners, from the Tibetan tradition and the Thai forest tradition and the Zen tradition, describe entering states in which what felt like years, subjectively experienced, with full narrative depth and the felt passage of time, transpired in the span of a meditation session measured in minutes by an external clock. Others describe the inverse, minutes that stretched into what felt like long, unhurried days. The temporal architecture of these states does not follow the physics of ordinary experience. And then there is the report that arrives from within the Tibetan tradition with a consistency that demands attention. Certain masters, describing the most advanced Brahma-level states, reported encounters not with the diffuse, luminous presences of the Deva realms, but with something more structured, beings of extraordinary refinement and intelligence who appeared with the specific intention of communicating something. And what they communicated, this is the part that the mainstream tradition tends to footnote rather than discuss openly, were meditation instructions, techniques, specific, detailed, transmissible practices that were subsequently written down and incorporated into living lineage traditions. The Dzogchen tradition acknowledges this openly. Certain of its core practices are described not as inventions of human teachers, but as transmissions, received in deep states by practitioners whose level of meditative development made them capable of functioning as receptors. Whether this is understood as contact with independent conscious beings, or as access to a depth of wisdom that lies beneath the ordinary individual mind, the practical result is the same: practices of extraordinary power, carrying the fingerprints of an intelligence that ordinary human circumstances do not seem sufficient to explain. These practices are still being taught by living teachers, in monasteries and retreat centers and small, quiet rooms where the air carries a particular quality of attention. Some of them were whispered, teacher to student, for 1,000 years before anyone thought to write them down. What lies above the Brahma realms is harder to describe, because above a certain level, description itself is the first thing that fails. There are 4 territories in the classical Buddhist map that sit above everything that has been described so far. They have names: infinite space, infinite consciousness, nothingness, and neither perception nor non-perception. But the names are not descriptions, they are signposts. The territory beyond each signpost cannot be fully communicated to anyone who has not crossed it, in the same way that the color red cannot be communicated to someone who has been blind from birth. The information exists, the transmission fails. What can be said is this: practitioners who have entered and returned from these states, the 4 formless realms, accessible through the arupa jhanas, describe them not as extraordinary experiences in the ordinary sense of that phrase. They describe them as encounters with the basic structure of experience itself, stripped of all the features that usually make experience recognizable as such. No sensation, no narrative, no location, no time, no self to evaluate what is happening. And yet, here is the word that appears again and again across traditions that have never read each other: clarity. A clarity so complete that ordinary waking life, by comparison, looks like something seen through fogged glass. Consider for a moment the reports from people who have come close to death and returned. The accounts are well documented, widely read, and consistently strange. The tunnel, the boundless light, the feeling of encountering a presence or intelligence that somehow contains everything and expects nothing. The sense that something has been shown that cannot be unseen, even though its content is, on return, impossible to articulate. These accounts come from people of every religion and none, from cultures across the world, with no opportunity for coordination or shared influence. They arrive at the same description. Now consider that the formless realms, accessed deliberately, through decades of training, by practitioners using a precise and verified set of techniques, produce descriptions that overlap with these near-death accounts, in ways that are too structural and too specific to be coincidental. The unbounded light, the dissolution of self into something larger, the paradox of clarity without an object, the sense of having seen the actual nature of the mind, beneath all the stories the mind tells about itself. The documentary does not claim these are the same experience, but it holds the parallel carefully in the air and asks the audience to sit with what it implies. There is one more thing the texts record about the formless realms, and it concerns the practitioners who entered them and did not come back quite the same. Not in a dramatic sense. No one became non-functional. No one disappeared. But a small and carefully documented number of practitioners returned from the deepest states profoundly, permanently altered in their relationship to ordinary life. Monks who could no longer find the usual sources of human satisfaction satisfying. Not depressed, the distinction was important to the teachers who observed them, but recalibrated, as if they had been shown a scale that made everything they had previously used for measurement seem approximate by comparison. The texts do not present this as a failure. They present it as evidence. Evidence that the territory the map describes is real. Evidence that what happens inside these states is not happening to the idea of the practitioner. It is happening to the practitioner. And the question that Chapter 5 was built to answer is this: what happens when the territory is real, the practitioner is real, and the journey goes wrong? The wellness industry has a blind spot. It is not a small one. The industry, the apps, the retreats, the popular books, the branding built around words like mindfulness and self-care and inner peace, has created a narrative about meditation that is relentlessly positive. Meditation is safe. Meditation is beneficial. Meditation is for everyone. The worst thing that can happen, according to this narrative, is that you might feel briefly uncomfortable as old emotions surface and resolve, the way toxins supposedly leave the body during a cleanse. This narrative has done an enormous amount of good. It has introduced millions of people to practices that genuinely help them. It has reduced the cultural stigma around seeking inner quiet in a world that doesn't value it. And it has made the entry point to these practices accessible in ways that were previously impossible. It has also, quietly, removed the fence from the edge of a cliff. The original texts are not uniformly positive about deep meditation. They are specific. They document, with the same careful precision applied to the Jhana states, the specific experiences and conditions that can arise during intensive practice and that require skilled guidance to navigate safely. They catalogue the visions, sometimes beautiful, sometimes terrifying, that appear at certain depths. They describe encounters with what the texts call asuras and petas and naga beings, presences experienced during meditation, whose nature remains debated, but whose psychological impact on the practitioner is documented and real. They discuss the dissolution of the sense of self in terms that explicitly acknowledge that this dissolution is not always peaceful, not always gradual, and not always something the practitioner has the resources to integrate without support. The tradition had a name for the most extreme of these passages. In Christian mysticism, it became known as the dark night of the soul, a period of profound psychological disintegration in which the practitioner's ordinary structures of meaning, identity, and emotional stability are dismantled before a new and more durable form of stability can emerge. The Buddhist tradition has equivalent terminology. The Tibetan concept of nyam describes a range of temporary experiences, some blissful, some terrifying, some simply disorienting, in ways that resist classification, that arise during advanced practice, and are specifically not signs that something has gone wrong. They are, the tradition insists, signs that something is happening. The confusion comes when practitioners encounter these states without a teacher to tell them this, and without the doctrinal framework that transforms terrifying experience into navigable territory. Contemporary research has confirmed what the ancient teachers documented. The Varieties of Contemplative Experience Project, a rigorous multi-year study conducted by researchers at Brown University, interviewed over 100 meditators who had experienced significant psychological distress directly attributable to intensive practice. The experiences documented included depersonalization, the persistent, disturbing sense that one is not real or not present in one's own life; derealization, the sense that the world is not real, that familiar environments have become alien and untethered from meaning; and episodes that were, by clinical description, indistinguishable from acute psychosis, hallucinations, thought disorder, the collapse of the usual distinction between inner and outer experience, lasting for periods of days or weeks. These were not weak people. They were not people predisposed to mental illness. They were serious practitioners, many of them experienced meditators by any reasonable measure, who had gone deeper than their preparation, or their support structure, or their access to skilled guidance could safely accommodate. The ancient teachers built systems to prevent exactly this. The Theravada tradition specified prerequisites: a stable ethical foundation, a healthy psychology, a teacher who knew the student, a community to support the practitioner, and a carefully graduated sequence of practices. Each prerequisite was not a bureaucratic requirement, but a practical necessity derived from centuries of observing what happened when it was absent. The modern wellness version of meditation removed most of these structures, not out of negligence, but out of the genuine desire to make a good thing available to as many people as possible. The good thing is good. The removal of the fence is something else. Knowing this does not make the practice dangerous. It makes the practice honest. And honesty, the tradition insists, is always where safety begins. The Buddhist map of existence does not only go up. This is perhaps the aspect of classical Buddhist cosmology that contemporary presentations are most consistently reluctant to discuss. The popular, accessible version of Buddhist teachings tends to focus on the higher realms, the paths of practice, the qualities of compassion and wisdom, and gradual illumination. What it tends to leave in a footnote, or remove entirely, is the fact that the same map that describes the Brahma realms and the formless territories above ordinary human experience also describes, in equal detail and with equal seriousness, what lies below. The Peta realm, often translated as the realm of hungry ghosts, is described in the texts not as a punishment destination in any moralistic sense, but as a specific quality of conscious experience, a state characterized by insatiable craving that cannot be satisfied because the capacity to be satisfied has been disrupted at a structural level. Not hunger for food, though that image appears in the iconography. A hunger that is metaphysical, the perpetual reaching towards something, connection, meaning, satiation, peace, that perpetually recedes the moment it is approached. People who have experienced profound addiction, or certain forms of depression, or the specific torment of wanting something that cannot be named and cannot be found, recognize this description from the inside. The Tirakana realm, associated with animal consciousness, describes a mode of awareness dominated by immediate sensation, immediate threat, immediate appetite, without the reflective capacity that allows for perspective or choice. And the Niraya realms, the lowest territories on the map, often rendered as hells in translation, describe conditions of conscious experience where suffering has become the total environment, not suffering as a mood or a temporary state, but suffering as the very medium of awareness, the way water is the medium that a fish exists in. The documentary treats these descriptions as the tradition intends them, as a map of real possibilities, not of afterlife destinations assigned by moral accounting, but of conscious experiences that a human being can enter during life, and that a practitioner in deep meditation can encounter if the conditions for their arising are present within the practitioner's own psychology. Reports from serious meditators about involuntary lower realm encounters during intensive practice exist in every tradition. They are not publicized. They are discussed in private, in teaching relationships, in the careful conversations between a practitioner who is frightened and a teacher who has been told about exactly this and knows what to do. They describe states of sudden, overwhelming craving that has no object, encounters with presences whose defining quality is desperate need, not dangerous to the practitioner, but distressing in the way that encountering suffering always is, states of claustrophobic darkness and a sense of entrapment that lasted, subjectively, for what felt like hours within a sitting of objective minutes. The original teachers did not hide this. They built for it. The metta practice, the systematic cultivation of loving kindness, radiating goodwill in all directions, was not simply a compassion exercise. It was protective technology. Practitioners were instructed to establish a field of metta before entering deep states, the way one checks weather and equipment before an expedition. Certain Pali recitations served as anchors, ways of re-establishing orientation within a particular tradition's framework when a practitioner began to drift in directions they had not intended. And in several monasteries in Southeast Asia, whose records survive in archival form, there was a dedicated role, a senior practitioner whose responsibility was not to meditate alongside the others, but to watch them, to monitor for signs of dissent, to intervene with specific, tested techniques when a practitioner's condition suggested they were moving in the wrong direction. An inner world lifeguard, if the metaphor is not too crude. Someone who knew the water and recognized when another swimmer was in trouble before the swimmer knew it themselves. Let us assume, for the moment, that the accounts are accurate. Let us grant the monks the same provisional credibility we extend to any researcher describing repeated observations from a domain we cannot personally access. Let us say that the realms are real, accessible, navigable, variable in their qualities, and genuinely inhabited by something that corresponds to what the texts describe. Then the natural question is not whether the monks could get there. The question is, what did they do when they arrived? The answer, preserved in the texts with a specificity that resists the interpretation of metaphor, is that they worked. Advanced practitioners in the classical traditions were not visiting the realms for the experience of visiting them. They were not spiritual tourists, ascending to the Brahma plains for a view and descending again to report what the scenery was like. They were performing functions, specific, trained, intentional functions that the tradition considered as serious and as skilled as any work done in the physical world. More serious, in many respects, because the stakes were understood to be greater. In the Theravada tradition, certain practitioners with deep jhana attainment reportedly used those states to directly perceive and teach beings in lower realm states, the Peta realms, the confused territories of craving and suffering described in the previous section. Not by traveling to them in any physical sense, but by reaching a depth of consciousness that made the same experiential territory accessible, and bringing to it the quality of awareness and compassion that the practice had developed. This was considered an act of merit, not in a token sense, but as a direct intervention in a form of suffering that ordinary means cannot reach. In the Tibetan tradition, the function was more systematically described and more precisely trained. The Bardo Thodol, the text the West knows as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, is almost universally understood as a guide for dying people, a text to be read aloud to someone transitioning through death. This interpretation is not wrong, but it is incomplete. The Bardo Thodol was also a training manual for practitioners whose meditative development had given them the capacity to maintain conscious awareness through the same experiential sequence that the dying undergo, and to use that capacity to guide other consciousnesses through it, not metaphorically, actively. Practitioners who had mapped the Bardo states through repeated meditation could, by extension, navigate them with intention when consciousness was transitioning in circumstances other than ordinary waking life. The practice of phawa, consciousness transference, one of the 6 yogas of Naropa, was designed for exactly this. A practitioner trained in phawa developed the capacity to project awareness out of the body and direct it with intentional precision to a specific destination. The training itself, documented in multiple lineages, involved progressive exercises in directing awareness to specific locations within and then beyond the physical body, using visualization, breath, and the stability of Jhana as the technical foundation. The most advanced practitioners could reportedly accomplish this, not only for themselves but in service of others, directing the consciousness of a dying person who lacked the training to do it independently toward a more favorable destination in the post-death transition. These claims are extraordinary. They are also among the most consistently documented in the classical literature, across traditions that developed independently and had no communication with each other. The Theravada texts, the Tibetan Tantric texts, the Zen records of dying masters, they describe different practices, using different technical vocabulary, toward the same understood purpose, the intentional navigation of consciousness through territories that ordinary awareness cannot access, in service of ends that ordinary action cannot achieve. And here is the observation that closes this section with something sharper than comfort. What modern consciousness science calls an unsolved problem, the question of whether awareness can exist and function independent of the physical brain, is the question these traditions spent millennia developing practical answers to. Not theoretical answers, practical ones, tested, refined, transmitted across generations. The science hasn't caught up. That doesn't mean the answer isn't there. There is a room in a monastery in the hills above Kathmandu that has not admitted daylight in 400 years. The walls are thick enough that sound arrives muffled and transformed. The door, when it closes, closes completely. Inside there is a bed, a toilet, water, minimal food passed through a hatch that opens and closes without admitting light. There is nothing else. No candles. No artificial illumination of any kind. The practitioner who enters this room enters with the understanding that they will not see the sun again for 49 days. This is dark retreat. One of the most radical practices in the Tibetan Dzogchen tradition, and one of the least known outside it. Its existence is not secret. Teachers discuss it openly with students who have reached a sufficient level of preparation. Its details are taught privately, in the context of a specific lineage relationship, but its purpose, and what actually happens inside it, is almost entirely unknown outside the communities that practice it. Here is what the tradition documents, verified across centuries of accounts from practitioners who completed the retreat and emerged with reports they spent years finding language for. In the first 3 days, the visual system continues operating in the way it was designed to operate, searching for input, generating the visual field it is accustomed to constructing. In total darkness, that construction produces the phosphenes that everyone sees when they close their eyes. Faint, sourceless light, patterns at the edge of perception. The mind is restless. It wants stimulus. It generates noise. Around day 4 or 5, something shifts. The visual system, finding no external input to process, stops insisting on external input, and in that cessation, something else becomes visible. Practitioners describe it consistently, not as hallucination, not as imagination, but as a different kind of light becoming perceptible when the ordinary competition of external light is removed. The Tibetan texts describe 5 specific lights that appear in sequence, each associated with a different quality of awareness, each a direct expression of what the tradition calls rigpa, the fundamental nature of mind, which is described as luminous in a non-metaphorical sense. Luminous as in, it produces light, not as poetry, as a description of what practitioners see in total darkness after sufficient time. The system was designed with a specific end goal. Every quality of mind that a practitioner encounters during dark retreat, every light, every presence, every dissolution of the ordinary sense of self, every descent into states that resemble sleep but maintain the thread of awareness, corresponds precisely to an experience described in the Bardo Thodol as occurring in the moments following death. The dark retreat is, among other things, a rehearsal. A living practitioner, through sustained darkness and meditative depth, moves through the same sequence of inner events that the tradition says consciousness moves through in the first days after the body stops supporting it. And by moving through it consciously, deliberately, with training, they develop a familiarity with the territory that, when the actual moment comes, replaces panic with recognition. A monk who completed a 49-day dark retreat in 2003, documented by his teacher and by a Western researcher who interviewed him at length after emergence, described what happened in the final week as something he could not have imagined from outside it. The distinction between sleeping and waking, he said, had become meaningless. Awareness was continuous across states that ordinarily break it, and in that continuity, he had encountered something that he described, after long silence, as the mind's own face. Not a vision, not a feeling. The direct recognition of what awareness actually is, seen from within awareness itself, with no intermediate interpretation. He emerged from the retreat altered in a way he said was not dramatic. He could function normally, hold conversation, eat meals, but irreversible. Something had been shown that could not be unshown. The world continued. His relationship to it had shifted, at a level deep enough that the shift did not show on the surface, but ran through everything. What the darkness showed him, modern science cannot yet describe. But it can measure what happens in the brain when external light is removed for extended periods. The findings, as it turns out, are less dismissive than anyone expected. Every night, you disappear. Not entirely, the body continues, the brain continues, the biological machinery of rest and repair continues its steady work. But the thing that considers itself you, the continuous narrative of identity that runs through waking life, goes offline. You enter sleep, and you surface from it with no memory of the transit. The hours between are, from the inside, largely absent. You were there, in some biological sense. The experience of being there is not accessible to you. This disappearance happens every single night of a human life. It is so universal that no one finds it remarkable. The tradition finds it extraordinary. Dream yoga, one of the 6 yogas of Naropa, practiced within the Kagyu lineage of Tibetan Buddhism, is built on a single premise: the disappearance is not inevitable. The thread of awareness that runs through waking life is capable, with sufficient training, of running through sleep as well. Not in a superficial sense, not just lucid dreaming, not just the occasional moment of noticing you are in a dream and becoming briefly conscious within it, but in the deep sense. The maintenance of a continuous thread of awareness through every stage of sleep, including the stages where dreaming itself stops, and what remains is the dark, apparently content-free void of deep dreamless sleep. Lucid dreaming, the state most people encounter the concept of awareness in sleep through, is approximately the first step of dream yoga, and a relatively modest one. In the classical system, becoming aware that you are dreaming and maintaining that awareness is treated as entry-level preparation. What it opens into is a practice of progressively extending that awareness into deeper and deeper sleep stages, transforming the dream content with intention, and ultimately maintaining an unbroken thread of consciousness through the transition into dreamless sleep, the void that is described, in the tradition, as experientially equivalent to the formless realms, and more specifically, to the clear light experience that arises at the moment of death. The training is systematic and graduated. It begins with daytime practices, specific qualities of attention maintained during ordinary activities, designed to create a habit of awareness that is strong enough to persist through the threshold of sleep. It progresses to pre-sleep visualization, holding specific images with precision and stability as consciousness descends, so that the continuity of the visual and attentional system bridges the waking-sleeping transition. It then moves to working within dreams, not just being aware of them, but deliberately altering their content, using the dream state as a training environment for a quality of intentional, directed awareness that has no effort in it. Effort, in dream states, is counterproductive. The state requires a quality of presence that is entirely relaxed and entirely awake at once. The final stage, maintaining awareness in deep dreamless sleep, is described in the texts as the moment when the practice meets its real purpose. Because in that dark, content-free void, stripped of all the stimulus and narrative that ordinary waking life provides, what remains is exactly what the dark retreat reveals in complete darkness: the mind's own nature, visible in the absence of everything that usually obscures it. Contemporary sleep researchers, working with experienced meditators, have found something that current neuroscience cannot fully explain. During deep sleep stages that should, by all conventional understanding, show the slow delta waves of unconscious neural activity, experienced meditators show something else: gamma wave activity, high-frequency, synchronized neural oscillations associated with high-level conscious processing and perceptual integration. These practitioners, by the EEG data, are doing something cognitively complex during stages of sleep in which non-meditators are not, by any available measure, having any experience at all. The science does not confirm dream yoga, but it also does not even slightly, refute it. And in the space between those two facts, a question lives that no one has yet adequately answered. Of all the techniques that the classical traditions preserved, the one most present in public life is also the one most thoroughly misunderstood. Breathing practices are taught in yoga studios and anxiety workshops and hospital wellness programs across the world. They are useful, they are accessible, and they are, relative to what the original teaching described, approximately what a key displayed in a glass case is to a key inserted in a lock. The Anapanasati Sutta, the discourse on mindfulness of breathing, attributed directly to the Buddha, and one of the most referenced texts in all of Theravada Buddhism, describes 16 progressive steps of breath practice. 16. The versions taught in modern secular contexts typically engage the first 3 or 4. The remaining 12 are rarely mentioned in public teaching, and the reason for their absence from popular instruction is not that they are obscure, it is that they describe outcomes that the modern mindfulness framing has no category for. The first steps are familiar: awareness of long and short breath, awareness of the entire body in relation to the breath, calming the body through the breath. These are the components you find in any mindfulness program. For good reason. They work. They are genuine, valuable entry points. Then the sutta continues. Step 5. Experiencing joy through the breath. Step 6. Experiencing happiness through the breath. Step 7. Experiencing mental formation through the breath. Step 8. Calming mental formation. At this point, the sutta is describing access to what are recognizably the first jhana states, the practice of breath, taken to sufficient depth, producing the rapture and equanimity and absorptive stillness that the jhana sequence describes. It continues further. Steps 9 through 12 involve the breath becoming a gateway to direct perception of the mind itself, not the mind's contents, but its nature. The relationship between awareness and breath at this depth is described as something like a dialogue. The breath reveals qualities of the mind's current state with a fidelity that no introspective verbal report could match, and the mind, fully present to the breath, begins to perceive itself through it. The final 4 steps involve the use of the breath as a vehicle for release, the progressive loosening of the mind's attachment to its own constructions, the breath becoming less an object of attention and more a current that the practitioner rides, the way a surfer rides a wave they did not create and cannot control but can, with sufficient skill, use with extraordinary precision. Advanced practitioners in the traditional Theravada forest lineages describe the breath, used in this way, as being capable of delivering a practitioner into the first jhana within minutes. Not hours, minutes. But the specific conditions required, the quality of attention, the precise degree of relaxed engagement, the absence of the grasping that disrupts the process, are not teachable in a generic format. They are teachable only in the presence of a teacher who has navigated them personally and can recognize in a student's practice the exact point at which the subtle shift needs to occur. The physiological mechanisms that underlie these effects are increasingly understood. Extended exhalation stimulates vagal tone, shifting the nervous system toward parasympathetic dominance. Specific breathing patterns alter blood CO2 levels in ways that directly affect the brain's default mode network, the system responsible for self-referential thought, the mental background noise of identity and rumination. Alternate nostril breathing, practiced in both yogic and certain Buddhist traditions, shows hemispheric synchronization effects in EEG studies that are consistent with reported states of unusual clarity and integration. The body is not separate from the practice. It is the instrument the practice plays, and the breath, understood correctly, is not a relaxation technique. It is a precision tool, capable, in the right hands, of opening states of consciousness that most human beings live their entire lives without knowing are available to them. At the end of the 19th century, in the teak forests of northeastern Thailand, a monk walked away from the monastery. He walked away from the organized institutional form of Buddhist practice that had developed in urban settings over centuries, with its rituals and administrative structures and publicly performed forms of devotion, and he walked into the wilderness. He was looking for something specific. He had read descriptions of states in the ancient texts that no one around him claimed to have experienced, and he had decided that the discrepancy between what the text described and what the institution offered was not something he was willing to accept. His name was Mun Puri Dato. He would spend decades moving through the forests of Thailand, Myanmar, and Laos, rarely staying in one location for long, sleeping under canopies, eating one meal a day, meditating through the nights in places remote enough that the only sounds were insects and the distant movement of animals. He was, by any ordinary measure, alone. He was, by the measure of the tradition he was reconstructing from the inside out, in exactly the right conditions. The accounts left by his students, who include several of the most widely respected meditation teachers of the 20th century, describe Ajahn Mun as a practitioner of the first order, not a theorist, not a scholar. A practitioner who had navigated the jhana states to their depths, who had encountered the experiences the texts described and verified them through personal investigation, who had developed what the tradition calls abhiññā, the higher knowledges that arise as natural byproducts of deep meditative development. The accounts are careful and specific. Students describe arriving at the forest hermitage where Ajahn Mun was staying and finding that he already knew details of their inner state, specific struggles, specific mental formations, that the practitioner had not disclosed to anyone. Students describe being told about experiences they had had privately and in silence, described with an accuracy that suggested access to something beyond ordinary inference. Ajahn Mun himself, in the accounts that his most trusted students recorded, described experiences in meditation of extraordinary specificity, encounters with beings, perceptions of distant events, access to states corresponding precisely to those described in the texts, with the same matter-of-fact tone a craftsman uses to describe the results of a familiar technique. The lineage he transmitted, carried forward by Ajahn Chah, Ajahn Lee, Ajahn Fuang, and dozens of others across Southeast Asia, Europe, and North America, is one of the most significant living repositories of classical jhana practice in the world today. These monasteries do not advertise, they do not market, they do not produce content. They produce practitioners. What Ajahn Mun recovered, or perhaps more accurately, what he never allowed to be lost in the first place, by refusing to accept the diminished version of the practice that institutional Buddhism had offered him, is the understanding that the texts mean what they say, that the states they describe are real, that the experiences they catalogue are accessible, that the map is accurate, and that the most effective way to demonstrate this is not to argue for it, but to sit down in a forest and follow the instructions until you find out for yourself whether the territory they describe is there. It is there. His lineage is the evidence. And the monks who carry it forward, in small monasteries and forest hermitages that look nothing like the popular imagination of Buddhism, are still navigating the same territory he navigated, using the same map, one breath at a time. In 1052 CE, a young man named Milarepa entered a cave in the high Himalayas and did not leave it for years. What drove him there was not peace. He had committed acts of violence. His early biography is extraordinary in its darkness, and he went into the mountains carrying that weight, looking for a transformation so complete that it would reach the roots of what he had done. What he found, under conditions of extreme cold, minimal food, and isolation so total that his skin reportedly turned green from the nettles he subsisted on, was exactly what the tradition promised: a systematic dismantling of the psychological structures that produce suffering, followed by the emergence of something on the other side that the tradition calls realization, and that Milarepa described in songs of such precise and devastating beauty that they are still sung in monasteries today. Milarepa is the most famous of the Himalayan cave hermits. He is not the most extreme. The tradition of solitary retreat in high-altitude caves, maintained continuously across more than 1,000 years in the Tibetan Buddhist world, produced practitioners who spent not years, but decades, in conditions that most human beings would not survive for weeks. The purpose of these conditions was not asceticism in a punishing sense. It was engineering. Extreme cold forces the body into its own resources. Minimal food reduces the biological noise of digestion, appetite, and the metabolic fluctuations that distract attention. Total isolation removes the social layer of the mind, the constant, subtle attunement to other people's responses, expectations, and presence that consumes an enormous quantity of mental energy without anyone noticing it until it stops. And high altitude, the tradition suggests, though the reasoning is experiential rather than physiological, creates conditions for a particular quality of mental clarity that lower, more populated environments somehow diffuse. The result, in practitioners who endured these conditions with the proper training and the proper guidance of a lineage teacher, was an acceleration of the practice's effects that could not be replicated in community settings, however serious those communities were. States that took decades to access in ordinary life could apparently be reached in years under these conditions. The deepest practices, the dark retreat, the dream yoga, the recognition of Rigpa, could be stabilized with a completeness that required the removed from everything quality of the cave. In the 1980s, a team of researchers from Harvard's Mind-Body Medical Institute, led by Herbert Benson, traveled to monasteries in northern India to study Tibetan practitioners of Tummo, the the generation of inner heat through meditation. What they found with thermal imaging cameras was unambiguous. Practitioners of Tummo could generate measurable, significant increases in body temperature in peripheral body parts, the fingers, toes, skin surface, under conditions of environmental cold that should have been producing the opposite effect. The body, directed by the mind, was producing heat, not symbolically, measurably. The cameras showed it, the thermometers confirmed it. The mechanism by which this was occurring was not, and still is not, explained by ordinary physiology. The cave hermits knew this was possible. They had been doing it for centuries. They did not consider it the point. It was, in the tradition's framing, a side effect of more important developments. But it was the side effect that a thermal camera could see, and seeing it forced a reconsideration that no argument had previously been able to produce. What the cameras could not see is everything else that the practice produces, everything that doesn't have a temperature. Here is the central difficulty, stated plainly. The most important part of what the ancient traditions preserved cannot be put in a video. It cannot be put in a book. It cannot be put in a course, a podcast, a retreat curriculum, or any format that allows one person to reach many people simultaneously without being physically present with any of them. The deepest transmission of these practices requires two human beings in the same room, over an extended period, one of whom has traveled the territory, and the other of whom is learning to navigate it, with a quality of attention and responsiveness between them that has no technological substitute. The Dzogchen tradition has a practice called the pointing out instruction, Rigpa Ngo Tro, in which a teacher who has recognized the nature of their own mind creates conditions in which a student, in that specific moment, directly recognizes it as well. This is not a teaching in the ordinary sense. It is an event. It requires both parties to be in a specific state. It requires a relationship deep enough that the student trusts the teacher at a level beyond intellectual assent, and it requires the teacher to have genuine access to what they are pointing toward, not knowledge about it, but actual presence within it. The instruction can be given in words, or in silence, or in a gesture, or in a question, or sometimes in nothing at all. What matters is not the content of the communication, but the quality of awareness in which it is delivered and received. This cannot be recorded. The recording of a teacher pointing has no more relationship to the transmission than a photograph of food has to eating it. The Theravada tradition's model of Kalyanamittata, spiritual friendship, describes the teacher-student relationship as the most important variable in the entire practice. The Buddha himself, asked whether spiritual friendship was half the path, replied that it was the whole path. Not because the individual's practice is unimportant, but because the conditions that allow practice to reach its depth are almost impossible to produce in isolation. The teacher provides not just instruction, but a field of reference, a living example of the destination, present in the same room, which the student's nervous system can orient toward in ways that no description can replicate. What this means practically is that the knowledge preserved in these lineages is only as robust as the human chain that carries it. Each generation of practitioners depends on the one before it. Each teacher's capacity to transmit depends on having received the transmission completely, which depends on having had a teacher who received it completely, which extends back in time in a chain that, if broken, cannot be reconstructed from texts alone. The texts are essential, but they are the score, not the music. The chain is not broken. It is thinner than it has ever been, in the sense that fewer people are maintaining the depth of practice required to transmit at the highest levels. And the pressures of the modern world, on time, on attention, on the willingness to commit to a decade or more of intensive training before claiming to understand something, are not making the maintenance easier. But the chain is not broken. There are living teachers. There are intact lineages. The most remarkable knowledge that human civilization has produced about the nature of the mind is still being transmitted, right now, in small rooms in Thailand and Tibet and Nepal, and increasingly in quieter corners of the world that most people would never think to look. Chapter 8 is about what happens when the people who do look are carrying laboratory equipment. In the year 2004, a paper was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that attracted an unusual amount of attention, not because its authors were unknown. Richard Davidson of the University of Wisconsin was one of the most respected effective neuroscientists in the world, and not because its methodology was questionable. It was rigorous, but because its findings were difficult to absorb within the existing framework of what the scientific community believed about the human brain. The paper described measurements taken from the brains of 8 Tibetan Buddhist practitioners with extensive meditation experience, averaging 34,000 hours of lifetime practice, compared to a control group of novices. Both groups were asked to engage in a specific form of open, objectless meditation, the cultivation of unconditional compassion without a specific object, a practice that the Tibetan tradition calls Rigpa Metta. While meditating, the experienced practitioners showed something that the EEG equipment recorded unambiguously: extraordinarily high-amplitude gamma-wave oscillations, synchronizing across widely separated brain regions with a coherence that the researchers had simply never seen before. Not in any previous study, not in any other condition, not even during the most cognitively demanding tasks that years of prior research had produced. Gamma waves, in the range of 25 to 100 Hz, are associated with the highest level cognitive functions, the integration of information from separate brain regions into a unified percept, the binding of disparate sensory inputs into coherent experience, the moments of sudden understanding that neuroscientists associate with insight and perceptual integration. They appear in ordinary brain activity, but briefly and at low amplitude. What the Davidson study recorded was gamma activity at levels so far beyond anything previously documented that one team member reportedly asked whether the equipment was malfunctioning. It was not malfunctioning. The implications take a moment to fully arrive. The brain states associated with the deepest form of Buddhist meditation, the objectless, open awareness that practitioners describe as closest to the recognition of mind's fundamental nature, produce the highest measurable index of integrated, coherent neural activity that has ever been recorded in a human brain. The state that practitioners describe as the dissolution of self, the falling away of the ordinary sense of being a bounded, located individual, that state is associated, neurologically, with the most sophisticated and highly organized activity the brain is capable of producing. This is the opposite of what most people would intuit. The dissolution of self should, in a naive model, correspond to reduced or disorganized brain activity, the brain winding down, quieting, entering something like sleep. It does not. The dissolution of self is, neurologically, an event of extraordinary integration, the brain operating with a coherence and a synchrony that ordinary identity apparently interferes with. Separately, research on the brain's default mode network, the set of interconnected regions active during self-referential thought, mind-wandering, rumination, and the construction of personal narrative, found that experienced meditators show dramatically reduced DMN activity during meditation. The network goes quiet. The mental background noise of I, the constant subtle generation of the story of who you are, and what you think, and what you want, and what you fear, fades. This fading, in neuroimaging data, looks structurally identical to what happens to the default mode network under the influence of psilocybin at therapeutic doses. Same regions, same pattern of quieting, same resulting reports from the people inside the experience. A dissolution of the ordinary sense of self, a quality of clarity and openness, a sense, described with consistent language across both meditation and psychedelic research, of encountering something more real than ordinary reality. The ancient teachers described the dissolution of self not as a loss but as a revelation, as the removal of an obscuration, the way removing a fog reveals a landscape that was always there. The neuroscience cannot explain why dissolving the self produces clarity rather than confusion. It can only record that it does. The explanation, the ancient teachers would say, is in the practice itself, not in the reading about it, in the doing of it. The human body, under normal conditions, is insistent. It wants food at regular intervals. It wants water. It regulates its temperature with a precision that tolerates only the narrowest variation. It breathes approximately 15 times per minute, every minute of every day, adjusting its rhythm to demand and supply with a responsiveness that operates without any conscious direction. The body manages itself. It does not require permission. It does not defer to the mind. It has its own agenda, and that agenda takes priority. Except, apparently, when it doesn't. The physiological measurements taken on practitioners in deep meditative states are among the most reproducible and least contested data points in the entire science meditation literature. The findings are simple to state and difficult to explain. In the fourth jhana and above, breath rate drops to levels that are physiologically anomalous, not dangerous, but far outside the normal range. Heart rate drops correspondingly. Oxygen consumption, the body's baseline metabolic demand, decreases in ways that the available explanations, relaxation, reduced muscle activity, lower core body temperature, account for only partially. Something else is happening that the current framework does not fully model. In Nirodha Samapatti, the cessation state, the eighth jhana, the changes are more extreme. EEG patterns during this state show a profile that does not match any ordinary state of consciousness, including sleep. The brain is not showing the patterns of wakefulness or any recognizable sleep stage. It is showing something else, a configuration that the tradition says corresponds to the complete cessation of mental formations, which turns out, neurologically, to look like something the brain does not otherwise produce on demand. Practitioners can be monitored entering this state, and the transition is detectable on the EEG as a distinct event, a shift, not a fade. The Tummo research, mentioned in the previous chapter, adds a specific and dramatic data point to this picture. The generation of peripheral body heat through meditative practice, documented with thermal imaging, confirmed with thermometers, reproduced across multiple practitioners in controlled conditions, demonstrates that the relationship between mental practice and physical output is not metaphorical. The mind, trained to a sufficient depth, can direct the body's thermal regulation in ways that bypass ordinary autonomic control. The mechanism is not understood. The phenomenon is documented. What the physiological data collectively suggests is that the classical descriptions of deep meditative states are not exaggerations or poetic descriptions of subjective experience. They are reports of genuine, measurable changes in the body's operating conditions, changes so significant that external instruments confirm what internal experience reports. The body, in the deepest states, does not forget to need. It is directed by the mind operating at a level of depth and coherence that ordinary waking life does not produce, to set those needs temporarily aside. The question that this raises, whether a mind capable of directing the body in these ways is capable of the other things the tradition claims it can do, is the question the next section addresses with the most uncomfortable honesty the documentary can manage. In 1972, the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States government began funding a research program whose existence would not be acknowledged for 23 years. When it was finally declassified in 1995, its accumulated files ran to more than 90,000 pages. The program had multiple names across its operational history: Scanate, Gondola Wish, Grill Flame, Center Lane, Sunstreak, Stargate, but its subject remained constant throughout: the systematic investigation of whether human consciousness could access information at a distance, independent of any known sensory mechanism. Remote viewing, as the ability was called, was tested under conditions designed to eliminate every possible conventional explanation. Subjects were placed in shielded rooms. Target locations were chosen randomly after the session had begun, preventing any possibility of prior knowledge. Judges who evaluated the responses were blind to both the targets and the subjects. The protocol was rigorous enough that it was reviewed and approved by statisticians with no connection to the program. Over the course of more than 2 decades and multiple institutional incarnations, the program's data produced results that statistical analysis described as significant beyond chance at levels that, in any other field, would qualify as a finding. The program's results were evaluated in 1995 by statistician Jessica Utz of the University of California, who concluded in her official report that the data demonstrated a genuine effect, that the effect was not explained by any conventional mechanism, and that if the same level of statistical evidence had been produced in a study of a new pharmaceutical drug, the drug would have been approved for medical use. Her co-evaluator, psychologist Ray Hyman, who approached the data as a committed skeptic, concluded that the statistical results were not easily dismissed, but that he remained skeptical about the interpretation. The program was closed in 1995, not because the results were negative. The official reason given was that the operational utility did not justify the cost. Now hold this next to the classical Buddhist literature on the idhis. The ability to perceive events occurring at a distance, dibakaku, the divine eye, is documented in the Pali Canon as a specific, trainable capacity that develops as a natural byproduct of the fourth jhana and above. Its development is described with the same matter-of-fact precision as the description of the jhana states themselves. This is what the practice produces in practitioners who reach this level under these conditions. Not all practitioners, not automatically, but repeatedly, verifiably, across the tradition. The correspondence between what the US government spent 23 years and $20 million investigating and what the Buddhist tradition has documented for 25 centuries is not a coincidence that demands a single interpretation. It is a question that demands a serious answer. Whether the phenomenon is real, whether consciousness genuinely can access information at a distance, independent of ordinary sensory mechanisms, is a question that the available data does not resolve cleanly in either direction. What it resolves cleanly is this. The dismissal of the question is not a rational response to the evidence. The evidence exists. It is documented. It is reproducible within the parameters the research produced. Something is there. What it is remains, as the tradition would say, a matter for direct investigation. Chapter 9 is where all of these threads pull together into something that resembles, finally, an answer. In 1995, philosopher David Chalmers stood before an audience at a consciousness conference in Tucson, Arizona, and introduced a distinction that reorganized the entire field. He separated what he called the easy problems of consciousness from the hard problem. The easy problems, understanding how the brain processes sensory information, generates behavior, integrates attention, produces reports about itself, are not actually easy. They are among the most complex scientific challenges that exist. But they are easy in one important sense. They are the kind of problems that, in principle, yield to the standard tools of science. Study the brain carefully enough and patiently enough, and the mechanisms will eventually reveal themselves. The hard problem is different in kind, not just in degree. It asks why there is subjective experience at all. Not how the brain processes visual information, that is an easy problem, but why the processing of visual information produces the felt quality of seeing red. Not how the brain generates the neural correlates of sadness, but why those correlates are accompanied by the experience of sadness. Why is there something it is like to be a conscious being? Why isn't all of this neural processing happening in the dark, without any accompanying experience? This question has no answer within the current scientific framework, not because the research hasn't been done, because the framework has no category for it. Subjective experience, the felt quality of being aware, is not the kind of thing that can be located in a neural circuit or measured in a brain scan. You can measure everything the brain does. You cannot measure the experience of being the brain that does it. The gap between the two, the explanatory gap, as it is called, has not narrowed with any amount of research. If anything, the more precisely neuroscience maps the brain's mechanisms, the more starkly the gap stands out. Now return to the monks. What the ancient Buddhist contemplative traditions spent 2,500 years doing was conducting first-person investigations of exactly the territory the hard problem describes. Not theorizing about it, not measuring it from outside, going inside it through the systematic, rigorous, patient training of attention that the Jhāna system represents, and examining it directly, the way a biologist examines a cell under a microscope, except that here, the instrument of investigation and the subject of investigation are the same thing. Awareness investigating itself. The findings from this investigation, documented across centuries, verified by independent practitioners, consistent across traditions that had no contact with each other, describe the nature of consciousness with a precision and a depth that neuroscience has not yet approached. Not because neuroscience is poor science, but because it is using third-person methods to investigate a first-person phenomenon, and the methodology contains a structural limitation that no amount of improvement in the instruments can resolve. The hard problem of consciousness is, among other things, an invitation to take seriously the possibility that the most direct path to understanding the nature of consciousness is not through instruments pointed at the brain from outside, but through the disciplined investigation of consciousness from within, using the one instrument that has direct access to subjective experience, which is subjective experience itself. The monks have been doing this for 25 centuries. Their data set is larger than any laboratories. Their findings are internally consistent and cross-culturally verified. The hard problem, examined from this angle, does not get easier, but it gets different. It begins to look less like a wall and more like a door. She had a PhD in neuroscience from a well-regarded American university and 17 years of rigorous research experience. She had published on the default mode network, had read the Davidson gamma wave studies with interest and a fair degree of skepticism, and had attended a 10-day Vipassana retreat twice in her 30s, with results she described as useful but modest. A temporary quieting of the mind's noise, a sense of spaciousness that lasted a few weeks and then dissolved into the habitual patterns of a busy academic life. What she was not prepared for was what happened at the 6-week retreat she attended at a forest monastery in Massachusetts when she was 41, under the instruction of a Theravada teacher who had trained in Thailand for a decade. On the 18th day of the retreat, during an evening sitting that she had entered with no particular expectation, something shifted in a way she would spend the next 4 years finding language for. The word shifted is not adequate. The shift was total. The distinction between the awareness and what it was aware of, a distinction that she had assumed was as fundamental to experience as the distinction between a canvas and a painting, dissolved. What remained was not emptiness. It was a quality of presence so complete and so free of the usual friction of self that the only word she returned to again and again in her later accounts was simple: relief. She remained in that state, with varying degrees of stability, for the rest of the retreat. She emerged changed in ways that she assessed with the same careful methodology she applied to research data, noting what had shifted, what had remained the same, what the mechanism might be, and how to account for it within the frameworks she had spent her professional life building. She is still assessing. The frameworks keep proving insufficient. He was born in Lhasa in 1971, trained in the Kagyu tradition from the age of 9, and completed a traditional 3-year retreat in his late 20s. He currently teaches small groups in a city in Western Europe. He describes the dark retreat not with drama, but with the language of a craftsman who knows his tools. The first week is the hardest, he says. The mind resists the darkness the way it resists silence, by generating noise. By the second week, something settles. By the third week, what the tradition calls the lights begin to appear. He describes them as precise and reproducible as the lights on an instrument panel, specific qualities of luminosity, specific locations in the visual field, each associated with a recognizable inner condition. By the 5th week, he says, the distinction between the inside and the outside of experience has become not philosophically problematic, but practically meaningless. And then there is a man in his mid-50s from a small city in the American Midwest, no religious background, no prior exposure to Buddhist teaching, who discovered classical Jhana instructions through an online community in his 40s and pursued them for 4 years under the guidance of a teacher he initially contacted by email. He does not use Buddhist terminology. He uses his own words. What he describes, in those words, corresponds with extraordinary precision to what the Pali texts describe as the second jhana. He had never read the Pali texts. When he finally did, at his teacher's suggestion, he sat with the book for a long time. They knew, he said, when asked what he thought. They knew exactly what it was. They just found it before I did. This documentary has traveled a long way. It began in a room in Myanmar, with a monk whose heart was beating 7 times per minute, and a question that had no clinical answer. It went back 2,500 years to the forests of ancient India, where wandering seekers without any institution behind them sat alone under trees and pushed the limits of what a human mind can become. It mapped the jhanas from the ground floor to the 8th, where language fails and the mind is awake in the face of nothing. It described the realms, the territories that the jhanas access, with the accounts of practitioners who went there and returned with reports that have not changed in their essential features across 15 centuries of independent verification. It documented the dangers, the guardians, the techniques, the science. And now it arrives at the center of everything that has been said. The map was never lost. This is the statement that the documentary has been building toward from its first sentence, and it requires some care to say correctly. The map was not hidden in a single location. It was not suppressed by a single authority. It was not destroyed in a single catastrophe. What happened to it is both simpler and more interesting than any of those dramatic possibilities. The map was scattered, distributed across lineages and traditions and languages and cultures that developed independently, each preserving a different fragment with extraordinary care, each believing, sometimes correctly, that the fragment they held was the complete picture. The Theravada forest tradition held the fragment that describes the Jhana path with the greatest technical precision. The Tibetan traditions held the fragments that describe the formless realms, the dark retreat, the dream yoga, the Bardo navigation, the consciousness transference, the practices that extend the Jhana path into territory it doesn't explicitly map by itself. The Chan and Zen traditions held the fragment that describes the sudden, non-gradual recognition of mind's nature that can occur without any of the systematic preparation, the pointing out instruction delivered through a question that breaks the mind's ordinary operating pattern and allows a direct glimpse that precedes all the techniques. Each fragment is real. Each is verified. Each represents something that human beings discovered about consciousness through direct investigation, refined through centuries of transmission, and preserved through the particular form of human courage that chooses depth over comfort, truth over reassurance, and the genuine difficulty of the real thing over the accessible warmth of a simplified version. When these fragments are assembled together, when the Jhana map and the realm map and the death map and the science data and the contemporary accounts are all placed in relation to each other, what emerges is not a complete picture in the sense of having no remaining questions. Questions remain, large ones, important ones, the kind of questions that a genuine field of inquiry is supposed to generate. What emerges is a direction, a coherent, internally consistent, cross-culturally verified direction toward an understanding of consciousness that is simultaneously the oldest project in human history and the newest frontier in human science. The project is not finished, but it is further advanced than almost anyone outside the communities that have been doing this work knows. And the most extraordinary thing about this direction, the thing that the documentary saves for last, because it is the only thing worth saving for last, is that it is open. It has always been open. The practices exist, the teachers exist, the lineages exist. The door that the monk in the opening room walked through is a door that any human mind can approach. The only question is whether you are ready to take it seriously. The living transmission of these practices is not where most people would think to look for it. It is not in the large, well-funded Buddhist centers in major Western cities, where weekend workshops and introductory meditation classes and Dharma talks delivered to full auditoriums represent something genuinely valuable, but far from the depth of what the tradition carries at its core. It is not in the popular books, however well written, that distill centuries of practice into 12 chapters and a reading guide. It is not in the apps, however thoughtfully designed. It is in smaller places, quieter places. In forest monasteries in northern Thailand, where the schedule begins at 4 in the morning, and there is no Wi-Fi, and the monks eat one meal a day, and the silence is the kind of silence that begins to feel, after a few days, like a physical substance. In retreat centers in the Himalayan foothills where teaching is given in short, precise sessions by teachers who spent years with teachers who spent years with teachers, who form a chain reaching back to practitioners who personally verified the states they transmitted. In small, barely advertised groups in ordinary cities in Europe and North America and Australia, where teachers trained in traditional settings work quietly with small numbers of students who are serious enough to receive what is being offered. The Thai forest tradition, carrying the lineage of Ajahn Mun, is the most accessible entry point for practitioners interested in classical jhana practice. Monasteries in this tradition exist in Thailand, the United Kingdom, Australia, the United States, and New Zealand, among other places. The practice is demanding, not in a punishing sense, but in the sense that it requires genuine time, genuine commitment, and genuine willingness to work under instruction, rather than self-directing from a position of insufficient knowledge. What is offered, in return, is the actual thing, not the popular version, the actual, classical, systematic practice of the jhanas as they were taught and transmitted and verified over 2.5 millennia. The Tibetan Buddhist traditions, Kagyu, Nyingma, and Gelug, each carry their own forms of the deeper practices. Dzogchen and Mahamudra transmission, which include the dark retreat practices and the recognition of Rigpa, are available through lineage teachers in Europe, North America, and Asia. These practices require substantial preliminary preparation, extensive foundational work that typically takes years, not as a bureaucratic gatekeeping mechanism, but as a practical necessity arising from the depth and power of what the practices produce. A surgeon requires years of preparation, not because hospitals are exclusive, but because the knife is real. The Zen tradition offers a different pathway, one that is less gradual in structure and more oriented toward the sudden recognition of mind's nature through the specific form of intensive practice and direct teacher-student engagement that Zen has refined over centuries. Formal Zen training in a traditional setting remains available through a number of lineages in Japan, South Korea, and increasingly in the West, for practitioners willing to engage with the form and discipline the tradition requires. And then there are the contemporary teachers, individuals trained in traditional settings who now work in more secular or hybrid contexts, making the principles of classical meditation accessible to practitioners who cannot or choose not to commit to a full traditional form. These teachers are less easy to find, and their quality varies widely. The key indicator is not charisma or public presence or the size of their following. The key indicator is whether they have a living teacher themselves, whether they exist within a lineage rather than having constructed their own synthesis. Synthesis has its place, but the practices described in this documentary were not developed through synthesis. They were developed through transmission, refined through generations of practice, and they are most safely and effectively accessed through the same mechanism. None of these paths are easy. All of them are available. The practices have survived everything: the fall of empires, the suppression of traditions, the distraction of modernity, the flattening of deep knowledge into accessible formats. They survived because what they describe is real, and real things persist. You do not need to travel to a monastery in Thailand to begin. You do not need to commit to a lineage, or accept a cosmology, or call yourself anything, or believe anything that the preceding chapters have described. The beginning of this path requires exactly none of that. It requires only one thing, and it is a thing that every human being already possesses: the capacity to pay attention. Not the ordinary, scattered, perpetually interrupted attention of a mind moving through a day saturated with input and demand. Something more deliberate than that, something more patient, something that is, in its quality, closer to the attention you would give to a sound that you are almost, but not quite, able to make out at the edge of hearing. Still, interested, quiet, without the urgency of getting somewhere. The practice, at its beginning, is simply this: find the breath. Not as a concept, not as a physiological process you understand intellectually, but as a sensation, the actual felt experience of air moving, of the body's rhythm, of the subtle aliveness that is present in every inhale and every exhale when attention is present enough to feel it fully, and stay there, not by force, by interest, by the quality of attention that the tradition compares to a mother watching a sleeping child, not vigilant, not strained, but present in the specific way that care makes presence effortless. What begins to happen, with consistency and patience, is a quieting. Not the grey quieting of a depleted mind, but the luminous quieting of a mind that has found its own actual resting point beneath the habitual noise. A quality of aliveness begins to emerge that was not absent before. It was simply overwhelmed. A sense of being actually here, in this moment, in this body, in this breath, with nothing required of that fact, except that it be noticed. This is the beginning. It is modest. It is also, the tradition insists, the same beginning that every practitioner described in this documentary once stood at: the forest monks in Thailand, the Himalayan hermits, the practitioners who completed dark retreats and dream yoga, and the most extreme journeys that human consciousness has ever undertaken. They all began here, with a breath and the decision to be present for it. The distance from here to the deepest states described in this documentary is real. It is measured in years and decades of patient, consistent practice. It is not a distance that self-deception or enthusiasm or the latest method can shortcut. But it is not a distance that requires anything beyond what a human being already is. The capacity is native. The equipment is already present. The road is long and has been walked before by people who were no different in their starting point from the person reading these words right now. All long roads begin with a single, ordinary step. This one begins with a breath. He is still there. In the monastery above the cloud line, in the room where a candle flame barely moves, the monk is still sitting in the position he has occupied for 3 days. The researchers outside the door have been joined by a third colleague who arrived this morning with additional equipment and a quieter form of disbelief than the other two. They speak in murmurs. They check their instruments. They look at the numbers, and then at each other, and then at the door, which remains closed. Inside that room, something is happening that none of their instruments can fully describe. The instruments can measure the body, the slowed heart, the barely moving breath, the temperature, the neural activity in its unusual configuration. What the instruments cannot measure is where the awareness has gone. What the instruments cannot follow is the practitioner into the territory he is currently navigating, using a map that was drawn by hands that turned to dust 15 centuries before any of the equipment in that hallway was conceived of. The researchers are scientists. They believe in what can be measured, and yet something about this room, about this stillness, about the specific quality of the silence behind that door, has produced in all three of them a sensation that none of them have yet found the clinical language for. It is not fear. It is not awe in the religious sense. It is the particular feeling that arrives when a person encounters something that is real and that lies outside the boundaries of what they previously understood to be possible. A quiet rearrangement, a small door opening. You have been in this documentary for the length of a long night. You have traveled from a monastery at 3 a.m. to the forests of ancient India, 2,500 years ago. You have moved through 8 floors of a building that leads off the edge of what ordinary perception considers the world. You have stood at the edge of the realm maps and looked outward into territories that have no name in any modern language. You have sat with the dangers, the guardians, the techniques, the science. You have listened to the accounts of people who went somewhere extraordinary and came back and tried, with varying degrees of success, to describe what they found. And all of it, every word of the last several hours, has been pointing at the same thing. Not at the practices, not at the monks, not at the realms or the jhanas or the neuroscience or the declassified government files, at the possibility, the specific, documented, cross-culturally verified, scientifically partially confirmed, experientially available possibility that the human mind contains more than the life most humans live ever accesses. That the ordinary waking state, the state in which virtually all of modern life is lived, planned, measured, and evaluated, is not the full extent of what consciousness is. That there is more, not as a metaphor or a hope or a consolation, as a fact demonstrated by 25 centuries of careful, rigorous, patient human investigation. The monk in that room is not doing something supernatural. He is doing something that is natural to the human mind, at a depth of development that almost no one, in the conditions of modern life, ever reaches. The extraordinary nature of what he is doing says less about him than it does about how far the rest of us are from what we are actually capable of. That is not a criticism. It is an invitation. The traditions are intact. The teachers are alive. The techniques have survived empires and centuries, and the flattening momentum of a world that prefers its knowledge fast and its wisdom optional. The door is not locked. It has never been locked. It has only ever been, for most people, invisible, because no one pointed at it and told them clearly what it was, and said, "That is real, and it leads somewhere, and you are allowed to open it." Consider this documentary the pointing. The monk will emerge from that room in his own time. He will drink water. He will eat a small meal. He will speak, eventually, in the quiet way of someone who has been very far away and is in no hurry to pretend that where he went was not real. The researchers will pack their equipment and drive back down the mountain with data that will take them years to interpret. The candle will have burned down by then. The door was never locked. It was only ever waiting.